For me, there's nothing quite so amazing as when a game is immersive to the point that it makes you feel like that world is really real and not just a game. Systemic game design is such a unique and effective way of bringing that level of immersion to a game. But first, a quick explanation of what it is. Basically, a game developed with systemic design in mind is one that has a set of rules or systems that interact with each other and that the player and NPCs can interact with. An example is how in Breath of the Wild, any items made of wood can catch fire. Therefore, Link's fire arrows can burn enemy shields, enemies that are on fire can burn Link's weapons or those of the enemy. There's a rule, there's a system. Wood catches fire. And this is not just limited to the player interacting with things. So how does something like that help with immersion? Well, basically it comes down to two things. One is that the systems in the game don't rely on the player to work. This helps create a world that lives and breathes and exists on its own, unlike many games where nothing happens in the world until the player gets there and does something. The second element of systemic game design that helps immerse a player in a world is that having a set of rules that mirrors reality lets the player interact with the virtual world in intuitive and natural ways. Therefore, they can solve problems in the game by thinking as they normally would rather than having to use video game logic. To explain further, let's look at Thief and Thief, two games starring Garrett the Thief, who has to find his way into mansions and steal everything in there. One pioneered systemic design, and the other didn't have anything to do with it. In Thief 1998, there is a system in which Garrett can fire a rope arrow at any wooden surface and it'll stick in it, leaving a dangling rope beneath for Garrett to climb or slide down if he needs a quick escape. You're first presented with this early on, and you can make use of the system however you like. Even if having a rope dangling from a wall serves no purpose, you can do it anyway, because that's one of the game's rules. In Thief 2014, Garrett can fire rope arrows into wooden beams just like before, except now there's no universal system for it. There is no system that says wooden surfaces interact with rope arrows in a certain way. Instead, there are specific wooden beams highlighted with white rope, and only those can be used for rope arrows. Even worse, the rope arrows will always attach to the exact same point in the beam, because they're just something to be activated when the game says you can. So what's all that got to do with immersion? Well, in Thief 98, it feels natural when you see a wooden surface. You can fling your arrow into it and it'll stick because that's what arrows do. That's just how it works in the real world, and that's how it works in the game. It makes sense. In Thief 2014, creating a rope with an arrow isn't something you need to think about. The game thinks about it for you and tells you strictly when you can do it. It's not natural because there are so many things you could fling an arrow into, but it doesn't stick in them like it should. It's just unnatural and gamey. Original Thief lets you think of the in-game world the same way you would the real world, and it works. New Thief makes you think of its game world as a game world, with strict rules. It really takes you out of the experience when you try and do something but the game just says no. But it's not just that on its own that makes me love systemic game design. Having systems in place like an Original Thief and Zelda Breath of the Wild allows player an immense freedom of choice. That said, I think this is integral to the immersion factor as well. In order for a puzzle solution to feel natural, the game must let the player do things how they want. Therefore, there has to be a myriad of solutions so as to reduce the chance of the player doing something that the developers haven't thought of that doesn't work in the game. That would break the immersion and remind the player that they're in a game, not in another world. This freedom of choice is present in all games based on systemic game design, and that design philosophy informs the world and level design. Like in Zelda, you can get over a wall by climbing it, using magnesis to pull metal objects to create a ladder, or set fire to grass to create a shaft of air that'll launch Link upwards with his parachute. All of these things are fun on their own, but the world of Hyrule has to be designed to accommodate the systems that allow the player to do those things. And the best way to do that is to create an open world filled with objects and materials for the player to interact with freely. The world doesn't have to be entirely open though. Thief has small levels that are designed to feel open because there are multiple paths for Garrett to take. Open windows halfway up a building or a locked door for him to pick and access the basement. If only one of these were present, the player wouldn't be able to freely make use of the game's systems and they'd feel restricted. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is that systemic design alone isn't what makes me love games like Breath of the Wild and Thief, and the immersion that those games provide doesn't come just from the fact their mechanics are based largely on systems within the game. Rather, it's the fact that systemic game design leads to, and indeed necessitates, realistic and believable world design which makes the player feel like they're in a real place. That in turn allows the player to think as though they were in a real place, and so they're able to feel immersed because they're not thinking like they're playing a game, but interacting with and actually feeling like they're in another world. I sure would love to see more games, especially in the AAA market, come out based around systemic game design. In a couple of years when VR gets better, I think the two would go together perfectly to create a super immersive gameplay experience. If you made it this far, thanks, well done, and I hope you enjoyed my video. I'd be happy to hear your thoughts on systemic game design or any games you thought were super immersive. Leave a comment down below.